over this past winter, Christmas, New Year's time, it's difficult to remember. Our family took a few trips, and I remember on one particular one of those trips, we were on the way home, and something happened that I think is an appropriate segue into our chapter. This morning, it was about dinner time. We're on the road. Holly and I start discussing where are we going to go for dinner? Where are we going to stop? We decide we're going to eat in the van because we want to get back early. It's a Saturday night, so Sundays happen week in and week out until the Lord returns, right? And so we're not wanting to get home late. We want to just eat in the car. It's fine, right? Just, hold things and try not to get in a wreck. This is what we do on road trips. And so the boys in the back overhear us having this discussion about where we were going to go to dinner. And as they do almost on a daily basis now, they request to go to Culver's, which is wonderful of all places. So we go to Culver's. We find one. It's on the next exit in front of us. So we go pull in. And as we're pulling in, you get that smell of the butter burgers, and you're just like, this is going to be so good. And I'm really hungry because, sometimes you're driving, you're not moving, or at least me, I've had a lot of coffee, and so I don't feel as hungry. But then it just hits, and I'm like looking at the menu, and I'm like, I want the biggest burger you have. And so I get this thing. We get back on the road. Holly pass out all the food. We make sure the kids are okay. I get situated, right? That's what you got to do. Fries are over on the door, right? Cup here. Burger, hand, other hand, steering wheel. That's what we do. And I'm looking at this thing like, this is going to be so good. And I'm so excited to sink my teeth into this thing. And I take the biggest bite I can in this burger. And immediately I know something's wrong. And the whole bite comes out on my lap because I spit it out because all I taste is pickle. I had ordered this burger to my liking, which of course means, those of you who know me, no pickles. But this one not only had pickles on it, all I could taste was pickle. And so I spit it all out right there and everything. Needless to say, I was profoundly disappointed in this dining experience. This is a silly example of a serious and sobering reality. Such is life with profound disappointment. Such is life in our fallen world. Each and every one of us will at one time or another encounter great and severe disappointment. Sometimes to such a large degree that we might actually believe that God has abandoned us and forgotten us. This is the theme of the chapter before us today. In Genesis chapter 40, as we continue to plug along in this first book in the Bible, we have seen Joseph successful in chapter 39 last week in the palace and successful in the prison. The Lord was with him to bless many others through him, to begin to bring about the great promise to Abraham and blessing the nations and all the world through the sons of Abraham. This is starting to happen in Egypt now through Joseph, and the Lord is with Joseph. But chapter 40 takes a dark turn when Joseph is forgotten and left in prison. Well, let's turn there and see this for ourselves in Genesis chapter 40. There are 4 headings. I know Mitch just said every great preacher has 3. I've got 4. So, what'd you say? Bonus. We have bonus today. First, see in verse 1 to 4, the setting. This is what the word says. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker, committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. This is the setting for the chapter before us and the events that will follow. But the timeline here is both clear and unclear. It is clear from verse 1 in chapter 40 that these events took place after the events in chapter 39. That's clear. It's unclear exactly how much time has taken place between these two chapters. We can, though, this is not, I think, speculation, this is an educated guess at the timeline here. As this final section in Genesis began in chapter 37, verse 2, it mentions that there, before arrogant, young, prideful Joseph boldly states his dreams to his brothers and his parents, he is 17 years old in verse 2. The next clear and only other explicit statement of Joseph's age comes near the end of chapter 41 in verse 46, which says Joseph is now 30 years old when he enters into Pharaoh's service. So I know I mentioned last week that in the Mrs. Potiphar episode where she's trying to allure him into bed, that he was 17 or 18. Let's make a little tweak and adjustment. He might be more late teens, early to mid-20s when that happened. All in all, 13 years go by between the time he's sold as a slave into Potiphar's house and when he will leave the prison and go into Pharaoh's service at 30. That's 17 to 30. In these 13 years, so many events had to have taken place. And we don't get to hear of them all. But this chapter shows us one sequence of events that's really important for us to know, as dark and distressing, but as real life as it is, because it's these sequence of events right here, this chain of events, that will ultimately lead to Joseph being delivered out of prison. But he doesn't know that yet. We do from our large and wide vantage point. And everything about these events has to do with dreams. And that's already been in view for Joseph, as he himself had dreamed a few dreams back in chapter 37. Ironically, then, it was dreams that would lead to his downfall. But dreams here will eventually lead to his deliverance. And so it's interesting that this happens, but before I digress any further, that's a bit beyond our present chapter. Chapter 40 is all about Joseph being forgotten. Joseph being forgotten. So what happened here? We saw it in this setting begin in verse 1 to 4, where two royal officials, a cupbearer and a baker, commit an offense against Pharaoh. Pharaoh, who is called here in these 4 verses, the king of Egypt, he gets angry. He throws these two into prison, the same prison where Joseph is being held. And the captain of the guard, if you remember chapter 39, that most likely is Potiphar, who's familiar with Joseph, who knows his work ethic, who knows the Lord's presence with him and the Lord's blessing on him to make everything succeed, who's probably a little bit jealous now that the prison is so successful while his house no longer has this blessing anymore. Maybe he's angry more at his wife for these things. Might be someone else, but it's most likely the same captain. He puts these two guys, these two officials, under the care of Joseph. Now, normally when we hear the words cupbearer and baker, We have this popular caricature in our minds where these are the two guys who are in charge of not only making sure that the king, that Pharaoh gets not only the best quality of food, but right, these are the guys that test it, right, to make sure it's not like poisonous. So if it's poison, they'll die before Pharaoh gets sick or ill. This is kind of like the caricature in part, but these roles are a bit bigger than the popular notions entail. We know this from later people in the Bible who also serve in the role as cupbearer. Who comes to mind when we think of this? Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king of Persia. He was not just the cupbearer, but he was something of the closest confidant and advisor to the king of Persia. So something is of the same in view here with these guys. The cupbearer and baker of Pharaoh were likely two of his closest advisors and royal officials. But they committed a grave offense. We don't know exactly what they did to so stir up Pharaoh's anger. Maybe the two committed totally separate crimes that were in two totally separate spheres of Egyptian life and just so happened to be around the same time, so they're thrown in together. Or maybe Pharaoh thought they were together conspiring or scheming against him in some way. Or maybe Pharaoh got sick after a meal, so sick that he got so furious at these guys in charge of his meals, and maybe this was part of the scheme, and so off to prison they go. Well, we don't know what exactly happened, but however it played out, verse 4 ends with them both in jail and both under Joseph's care. That's the setting. Point 2, the next heading, is the dreams, verse 5 to 8. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So in Egyptian popular culture, we need to know this in order to interpret these events rightly. In Egyptian popular culture, sleep and dreams played a large governing role. They believed that sleep and dreams put them into direct contact with the realm where the gods dwelled. And so dreams were not only seen as a gift of the gods, they were seen as guidance for each individual's fate or fate of groups or families or the nation, as a gift from the gods to guide and show and reveal their fate. And so because of all this, the art of interpreting these dreams to give such guidance was a vocation in Egypt that was highly prized and widely respected in the nation. Now, knowing this detail is important for what's to come and why they're so downcast after these dreams when they're in prison. So there are the cupbearer and the baker in prison. Verse 5 says they both dream dreams. But then let's see verse 6. Joseph has matured in his care of others because he's clearly aware of how they're doing and how they're not doing well. He's aware of their needs. He notices that these two new inmates look troubled. It says troubled there in the ESV, our translation of choice here. But this word in Hebrew could be translated as ill or sick, even furious or angry. So there's this combo going on in this one word trouble, where these guys had their dreams and they were so sick with worry about them that it affected their demeanor to such a degree that when Joseph woke that morning and saw them, he was like, what's going on? Why are you so furiously, angrily, fretful, worried, sick looking? What's going on with you? We have had dreams, they said, and there's no one to interpret them. To which Joseph then responds in verse 8, do not interpretations belong to God? There's so much to see here. That the baker and the cupbearer say what they say to Joseph reveals to us much of what we've already discussed about the prominence and the popular culture of Egypt and the importance that was placed upon dreams and their right interpretations. Remember, this was secrets revealed, guidance given, fate disclosed. But because they were in prison, they no longer, according to their own imaginations, had access to the experts who were rightly trained, in their opinion, to interpret such a dream. So they could not, this is something of their maddening despair, they could not find out the fate that had been revealed to them. Because the experts were not in prison. They didn't have access to them. Well, Joseph responds here with a comment that is probably for them as surprising as it ought to be for us, stunning. Do not interpretations belong to God? Now again, remember who he's talking to. These are not just like common level peasants he's talking to. These are two of the most important royal advisors and officials to the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who for their entire lives had embraced this worldview and this narrative about how life exists, that the gods reveal fate through dreams. Experts that would have interpreted them, that are no doubt in this culture, trained in all kind of pagan, idolatrous voodoo and mysticism to interpret such dreams and to reveal their secrets. Yet Joseph, in this one statement, rejects everything about that worldview and tells these prisoners that the interpretation of the dreams only belongs to God. Can you imagine what they would have thought hearing these things? But then they're in prison. Who else are they going to go to for the secrets of their fate to be revealed? And so, hearing that no mystic or voodoo will get them what they want, that only God will give it to them, and that Joseph is saying, please tell it to me, they decide to do so. And Joseph, having said this and having some experience with dreams himself, remember chapter 37, is set to hear their dream and give the interpretation. Which leads to the next and the longest section of the chapter, the interpretation, verse 9 to 19. So the chief cupbearer, starts with him, told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. That's the cupbearer. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. So here are the dreams. Joseph first hears the cupbearer's dream. Verse 10 to 11, there was a vine, 3 branches, budded, grapes, wine, a cup. Give the cup back to Pharaoh. That was the cupbearer's dream. Joseph gives the interpretation in verse 12 and 13. The 3 branches are 3 days, at the end of which the cupbearer, notice the verbiage, will be lifted up. His head will be lifted up out of prison and restored to his office, where he will resume his duties as before. But notice what else Joseph tells him in verse 14 and 15. Only remember me. Don't forget me when it's well with you to do kindness. We saw this word last week. It was translated steadfast love. It's now translated kindness. It's the same word hesed here in view. Its importance is quite similar in each context here. But he says, kindly remember me and do not forget me once you are restored. Why? I was wrongly stolen from my home and wrongly imprisoned here with, I'm sure you've heard the details. Now the baker. But first see the start of verse 16. The baker hears that the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream was favorable. And so he grows confident. And he's like, yeah, good dreams, good interpretation. This is a good psychic reading that we're getting here. It's probably how he's interpreting it, right? Something like this. And he's like, okay, so now that I know that probably mine's going to be similar, he grows in boldness. He's like, now here's my dream. And he tells him, he says, there were 3 cake baskets on his head, and that the birds were coming and picking and eating out of the top basket, which alone had a large assortment of baked goods in it. That the birds were coming and eating this off of his head. Joseph answers, the 3s in your dream, like the cupbearers, are 3 days. And he uses the exact same verbiage. Just as the cupbearer's head will be lifted up and restored, so to your head, Pharaoh will lift up from your body as you're hanging from a tree after you've died. One can only wonder how the baker responded to this. We don't know. It's silent on any response from these guys. I'm sure the cupbearer is fairly happy, and he's like, well, sorry, I got the good interpretation. You got the bad one. You're going to die. Can you imagine these 3 days just being played out like, well, all was going good in this interpretation for the baker. There was a basket with all kinds of breads and cakes, nothing short of something like a feast in this top basket for the baker. But it would announce his death. The cupbearer would be as comforted by his dream as the baker would be haunted by his own. So then it's silent about these 3 days. Then the text brings us to the outcome, the last final heading for us today in verse 20 to 23. See the text. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. This is a quick ending. It's one of those moments where you want to just file this away. When we're in glory, you want to be sure among like the myriad and countless people that are there to find Joseph, be like, tell me about the prison, those 13 years. Tell me about these 3 days of the interpretation. Tell me how this all played out. We don't get these details. We want to know details. But it's a quick outcome. 3 days later, like both dreams said, came the birthday of Pharaoh, on which he had a feast, during which the cupbearer was restored to his former role, while the baker was hung, as Joseph said. We've thought about what it was like for these two officials in those 3 days, but can you imagine it from another perspective, from Joseph's? As that morning of the third day came, and they heard and saw the rest of the royal officials or the more captains of the guard come down and get these two guys out of prison, you wonder, Joseph is probably like, okay, the baker can go, hey, cupbearer, hey, remember we talked about, remember? Don't forget me. You're going to go off. You're going to be restored. It'll be fine. Remember, don't forget me. And he's like, sure. How could I ever forget the prisoner who interpreted my dream in such a favorable light? How could I ever forget you? The rest of the day passes. Evening comes. No one has come to get Joseph. The first day passes. The first week passes. The first month passes. And slowly but surely, Joseph is starting to understand that the cupbearer has not remembered him. If you go one verse forward into chapter 41, in literally the first phrase, we will learn the truth of the situation. It would be 2 more years before the cupbearer remembers Joseph. It is as sad for Joseph as it almost the success of the cupbearer was blinding to him. Once he's restored, he forgot all about his sorrows by putting the cup back in the hand of Pharaoh. And so the gutting detail in verse 23, yet the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Though correct in his interpretation of the dreams, Joseph is left in prison, bitterly disappointed and hopelessly forgotten, at least for now. I said as I began that each and every one of us will at one time or another encounter great and severe disappointment. So much so that we might believe that God has actually abandoned us or forgotten us. Joseph seems to have been entirely forgotten at the end of chapter 40. We only have to wait literally like the time it takes to go to the next paragraph and start reading to see that he's not forgotten. But those first few words, after 2 whole years, it's so quick for us. 2 whole years for Joseph being forgotten in prison. This experience of having hopes raised high only to be dashed, of being seemingly forgotten or apparently fruitless waiting, is so common among God's people, both present and down through the pages of Scripture. As we've gone through these 40 chapters now in Genesis, this past year and a half, we've seen how Adam and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob have all had moments in their life where they had similar moments of despair and disappointment. Job is an entire book dealing with large and severe suffering and disappointment. You heard words as we began our gathering together from Psalm 55 that God gives us inspired vocabulary to express back to Him, interestingly, in song, about being so disappointed. Another one of them is Psalm 13, verse 1, that begins with the words, "How long, O Lord, have you forgotten me forever?" Israel, as a nation, would experience seasons like this in their own life as a nation. Jesus Himself had times like this in His own life and ministry, and so did Paul, and so did all the other apostles. Lesson? Bitter disappointment, apparently fruitless seasons of waiting, and being seemingly forgotten is not rare for God's people. It's something of a pattern that we ought to learn from Scripture. We ought to learn it, that it's normal for the Christian. Whether we're in the midst of those seasons, we need to be reminded of it, or whether we need to learn it now before they happen. This is not strange for those that follow Christ. It's something of a pattern or a paradigm for the life of the church. Joseph, according to him, if you could talk to him, 6 months in, still waiting for the cupbearer, he's frustrated. He's angry. He probably is as troubled in his own look as those two officials were that morning they had their dreams. According to Joseph, he was delayed and disappointed. But church, such a season did not stop the sovereign purposes of God. Such a season did not thwart the Lord's plans for His people. In fact, such a season was part of the plan for God's people. It was part of the purpose, part of the providential ordering of all events to bring about the outcome that God wanted. We know that from the rest of the story. Joseph doesn't know that. And so the end and the beginning of chapter 39 still ring true. When Joseph was in the palace, the Lord was with him. When Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him. And here, being seemingly forgotten, having his hopes raised high only to be dashed on the rocks, the Lord is still with him. The same is true for us today. That's the point of this chapter. That's the point of the sermon. The same is true for us today. One of the greatest gifts of the gospel is assurance. One of the greatest gifts of the gospel is assurance. When we see the work of Christ for us, when we see the work of Jesus for us, His righteous life lived for us, His sacrificial death dying for us, His rising to walk in triumph and victory over all sin for us, when we see that, and when we place our faith in this Christ, being so stunned by his person and his work, we are truly, in that moment, wondrously saved. But we're also given the promise that we will one day be saved as well. And so we know the truth. Christ has come. Christ will come again. We have been saved. We will be saved. These are both true. Knowing these things pours a flood of rich and abundant assurance into our souls in the present moment. So though we may encounter, church, deep seasons of disappointment and seemingly apparent fruitless waiting, or we might even be convinced that we've been forgotten or left out, though man may forget us, God always remembers his people, and he is always with his people. Remember the words at the end of the Great Commission in Matthew 28? And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Church, we might have nothing, but we have Christ. And with him, we have everything.